This 1898 photograph hides a detail historians completely missed, until now. Dr. Rebecca Torres had seen thousands of old photographs in her 15 years as a digital genealogist, but something about this one made her pause. It was a Tuesday afternoon in February 2024, and she was working from her small office in Boston, Massachusetts, scanning through a collection of images submitted by the Hendricks family, descendants of a once prominent Richmond, Virginia household from the late 1800s. The photograph before her was a formal family portrait dated 1898. The Hendricks family sat rigidly in a photographer's studio, dressed in their Sunday best. Thomas Hendricks, the father, stood behind his seated wife, Elizabeth, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. 3 children surrounded them, 2 girls in white lace dresses, and a boy in a dark suit with a stiff collar. The sepia tones had faded over the decades, giving the image a dreamlike quality. Rebecca leaned closer to her monitor, adjusting her glasses. She had been hired to trace the Hendricks lineage for a client planning a family reunion, and this photograph was supposed to be straightforward documentation. But as she began applying digital enhancement techniques, adjusting contrast, sharpening details, removing age spots from the image, something extraordinary emerged. Her breath caught. In Elizabeth Hendricks' lap, nestled between the 2 daughters, was a baby. And unlike every other person in that photograph, this child's skin was unmistakably darker. The infant couldn't have been more than 6 months old, wearing a simple white gown that contrasted sharply with the elaborate clothing of the other children. Rebecca sat back in her chair, her heart racing. She had restored countless Victorian-era photographs, had seen all manner of family configurations, but this was different. In 1898, Virginia, during the height of Jim Crow segregation, a white family posing formally with a black infant was not just unusual, it was virtually impossible. She zoomed in further, examining every detail. The baby's features were clear, undeniable. The mother's arms wrapped around the child protectively, naturally, the same way she held her other children. There was no awkwardness in the pose, no sense that this child was separate from the family unit. Rebecca reached for her phone, then stopped. She needed to be certain before she called anyone. She needed to understand what she was looking at, because if this photograph was genuine, and her professional eye told her it was, then she'd stumbled onto something remarkable, something that had been hidden in plain sight for over a century. Outside her window, evening shadows stretched across the Boston streets. Rebecca pulled her cardigan tighter and opened a new research file on her computer. Whatever story this photograph held, she was determined to uncover it. Rebecca spent the next 3 days doing nothing but research. She canceled 2 client meetings and barely left her office, surviving on coffee and takeout containers that accumulated on her desk. The photograph remained open on one monitor, while the other displayed a growing web of digital archives, census records, and historical documents. The Hendricks family, she learned, had been moderately wealthy tobacco merchants in Richmond. Thomas Hendricks owned a small processing facility near the James River, employing about 20 workers. Elizabeth came from a respectable family. Her father had been a lawyer before the Civil War. They lived on Grace Street, in a neighborhood known for its Victorian homes and manicured gardens. Nothing in the public record suggested anything unusual about the family. Their 3 biological children, Margaret, William, and Anne, appeared in the 1900 census, along with 2 domestic servants. But there was no mention of a 4th child, no mention of any adoption, no mention of the baby in the photograph. Rebecca pulled up the original image again, examining the studio mark embossed in the corner. J.W. Davies, photographer, Richmond, VA. She made a note to research Davies later. Photographers often kept detailed records of their clients. She then turned to genealogical databases, searching for any Hendricks family documents that might have survived. Birth certificates, death records, church registries, anything that could explain the presence of this child. Hours passed. The winter sun set early, and her office grew dark except for the glow of her screens. Then, at nearly 9 o'clock that evening, she found something. In the archives of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond, digitized only 2 years earlier, she discovered a baptismal record from March 1898. It listed a child named Samuel, parents Thomas and Elizabeth Hendricks, but there was a handwritten notation in the margin, almost illegible, adopted by grace and Christian charity. Rebecca's pulse quickened. Samuel. The baby in the photograph had a name. She searched for Samuel Hendricks in every database she could access. Nothing. No death certificate in Richmond. No census entries after 1898. No marriage records, no military service, no newspaper mentions. It was as if Samuel had simply vanished from history after that baptism. But people didn't just disappear, especially not in an era when records were carefully maintained. Someone had deliberately erased this child's existence from the official record. The question was why, and what had happened to him. Rebecca stood and walked to her window, looking out at the quiet Boston street below. A few pedestrians hurried past, bundled against the February cold. She thought about Richmond in 1898. A city still scarred by war, rigidly divided by race, governed by laws designed to keep black and white lives completely separate. And yet, the Hendricks family had brought a black child into their home, had posed with him for a formal photograph, had baptized him in their church. Someone, somewhere, knew what had happened to Samuel. Rebecca just had to find them. Rebecca knew she needed to go to Richmond. Digital archives could only reveal so much. Some stories required touching the actual documents, walking the actual streets, breathing the air of the place where history had unfolded. She booked a flight for the following Monday and began mapping out her research strategy. Her first stop would be the Valentine Museum, Richmond's premier history institution, which housed extensive photographic collections from the Victorian-era. She contacted the head archivist, explaining her discovery and requesting access to any materials related to J.W. Davies, the photographer whose studio mark appeared on the Hendricks portrait. The archivist, a man named Dr. Paul Winters, responded within hours. His email was brief but intriguing. "We have Davies's business records and several personal journals. I think you'll find them very interesting. How soon can you get here?" 4 days later, Rebecca sat in a climate-controlled reading room at the Valentine Museum, white cotton gloves on her hands, carefully turning the pages of a leather-bound journal dated 1897-1899. J.W. Davies had kept meticulous notes, not just about his business transactions, but about his clients, the social dynamics of Richmond, and his own observations on the world changing around him. She found the entry she was looking for on a page dated November 3rd, 1898. "Today I photographed the Hendricks family," Davies had written in careful script. "It was the most unusual sitting of my career. Mrs. Hendricks arrived with 4 children, not 3 as I expected. The youngest, an infant she called Samuel, is clearly of African descent. I must confess my shock, but Mrs. Hendricks spoke to me with such quiet dignity that I found myself unable to refuse her request." Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she continued reading. She asked me to photograph the family as they are, all together, without pretense or separation. Mr. Hendricks stood silent but resolute beside her. I could see the weight of their decision in both their faces, the understanding of what this photograph might cost them if it were widely seen. Mrs. Hendricks told me the baby's mother had been their cook, a woman named Clara, who died bringing him into this world. "We made a promise to her," Mrs. Hendricks said. "We promised Samuel would be raised with love as one of our own." Davies continued, "I took the photograph, knowing it might be the most dangerous image I ever created. In this city, at this time, such a thing is not merely controversial. It is potentially criminal under our increasingly strict segregation laws. Yet I could not deny the love I saw in that family. Sometimes a photograph captures not just what is, but what should be." Rebecca sat back, her heart pounding. Here was confirmation, not just of Samuel's existence, but of the extraordinary circumstances that brought him into the Hendricks family. A promise made to a dying woman, an act of compassion that defied every social convention of the time. But the journal raised as many questions as it answered. What happened after the photograph was taken? How did the family navigate Richmond's brutal racial codes? And why had Samuel disappeared from all official records? Dr. Winters appeared at her shoulder. "Finding what you need?" "More than I expected," Rebecca said softly. "But I need to know what happened next. Are there city records from that period? Court documents? Anything that might mention the Hendricks family after 1898? Winters nodded slowly. "There's something else you should see. We have a collection of letters donated by a woman who claimed to be a distant Hendricks relative. They've never been fully cataloged. Most historians assume they were just routine family correspondence, but given what you found," he paused, "they might tell the rest of the story. The letters were housed in 3 acid-free boxes, organized chronologically, but never thoroughly examined by researchers. Dr. Winters carried them to Rebecca's table with reverence, as if sensing they contained something precious that had long waited to be discovered. Rebecca began with the earliest letter, dated December 1898, just 1 month after the photograph had been taken. It was written by Elizabeth Hendricks to her sister Caroline, who lived in Philadelphia. "Dearest Caroline," the letter began in elegant cursive, "I write to you in confidence, knowing your generous heart will understand what others cannot. Thomas and I have taken in Clara's baby, the child she brought into this world at the cost of her own life. We have named him Samuel, and he is as much our son as Margaret, William, or Anne." Rebecca read carefully, noting the defensive tone, the anticipation of judgment even from family. "I know what you must be thinking," Elizabeth continued. "I know the dangers we face, the laws we are breaking simply by raising him under our roof as our child. But, Caroline, you did not see Clara's eyes as she held him those brief minutes before she passed. You did not hear her voice when she begged us to keep him safe. How could we turn away from such a plea? How could we call ourselves Christians and abandon an innocent child to an orphanage or worse?" The letter went on to describe the practical challenges, finding a doctor willing to examine Samuel, the whispers from neighbors, the difficulty of taking him to church, Elizabeth wrote of hiring a wet nurse, a black woman named Ruth, who came to the house discreetly through the back entrance and who became Samuel's fierce protector. Rebecca moved to the next letter, dated March 1899. The tone had shifted. Elizabeth's words carried an edge of fear. The photograph was a mistake, Caroline. I know that now. Someone saw it at the studio, a customer or perhaps Davies's assistant, and word has spread through Richmond like fire. We have received 3 threatening letters, unsigned, warning us to correct our sin or face consequences. Thomas went to the police, but they offered no help. One officer told him plainly that we had brought this trouble upon ourselves. Rebecca's chest tightened. She could almost feel Elizabeth's terror through the century-old paper. We are being watched, the letter continued. Men stand across the street at odd hours. Our business has suffered. Several clients have canceled their accounts. Margaret came home from school crying yesterday because the other girls won't speak to her. Even our church has grown cold. Reverend Morrison suggested, as delicately as he could, that perhaps Samuel would be better served in a colored orphanage. I wanted to scream at him. Instead, I simply took Samuel's hand and walked out of that sanctuary, and I will not return until they remember what sanctuary truly means. There were more letters, each documenting the family's increasing isolation. Friends stopped calling. Dinner invitations ceased. Thomas's brother wrote a cruel letter disowning them entirely, but through it all, Elizabeth's resolve never wavered. In every letter, she described Samuel's growth, his first smile, his attempts to crawl, the way Margaret sang to him each night. Then Rebecca reached a letter from July 1899, and the words made her blood run cold. They tried to take him, Caroline. They came in the night, men with torches, shouting that we were violating God's order and Virginia's laws. Thomas met them at the door with his rifle. I held Samuel upstairs, covering his ears while he cried, while our other children huddled terrified in Margaret's room. The men left, but not before promising they would return. We have 1 week, they said, to make this right. Rebecca's hands shook as she read Elizabeth's final words in that letter. We cannot stay in Richmond. We will not surrender Samuel, so we must disappear. Thomas has made arrangements. By the time you receive this, we will be gone. Pray for us, sister. Pray that love proves stronger than hate. The next box contained no letters from Elizabeth. Instead, Rebecca found a single envelope postmarked from a small town in Pennsylvania, dated 1901, addressed to Caroline. Inside was a brief note in different handwriting. Thomas's, Rebecca guessed. Caroline, Elizabeth wanted you to know we are safe. The children are well. That is all I can say. Please destroy this letter after reading. We cannot risk anyone tracing us. May God bless you for your kindness. T. That was the last letter in the collection. Rebecca sat in the silent reading room, processing what she had just learned. The Hendricks family had fled Richmond, abandoning their home, their business, their entire lives to protect Samuel. They had vanished deliberately, erasing themselves from history to save a child they had promised to love. But where had they gone? And had Samuel survived? Had he grown up safe? Or had the hatred that chased his family from Virginia ultimately destroyed them? She needed to find out, and she knew exactly where to start looking. Rebecca returned to Boston with copies of the letters and a burning determination to trace the Hendricks family's movements after they fled Richmond. The fragment of information she had, a postmark from Pennsylvania, dated 1901, was barely enough to start with, but she had worked with less before. She began systematically searching census records for Pennsylvania towns within 100 miles of Philadelphia, reasoning that Thomas might have chosen somewhere close enough to his sister-in-law for occasional contact, but far enough from Richmond to feel safe. She searched for families named Hendricks with the right age children, though she suspected they might have changed their name entirely. For 2 weeks, she found nothing. Every lead dissolved into dead ends. Then, late one evening, she decided to try a different approach. Instead of searching for the Hendricks name, she searched for family units matching their profile. A couple with 4 children, 3 white and 1 black, living together in Pennsylvania between 1900 and 1910. The search parameters were unusual enough that only 3 results appeared. 2 were clearly unrelated, but the third made Rebecca sit upright in her chair. In the 1900 census, for a small town called Meadowbrook, Pennsylvania, a rural community about 40 miles west of Philadelphia, there was a family listed under the name Henderson. Force. Household consisted of Thomas Henderson, age 42, occupation listed as merchant, his wife Elizabeth, age 39, and 4 children, Margaret, 12, William, 10, Anne, 8, and Samuel, 2. Samuel was listed as adopted, with his race marked as mulatto, an offensive term of that era for mixed-race individuals. Rebecca's heart raced. The ages matched perfectly, the first names matched, and the surname was close enough to suggest a deliberate but simple disguise. Henderson instead of Hendricks, a change that would be easy to remember but hard to trace without knowing what you were looking for. She immediately began searching for records related to the Henderson family in Meadowbrook. Within an hour, she had found a property deed from August 1899, just 1 month after Elizabeth's final letter from Richmond, showing Thomas Henderson purchasing a small farm on the outskirts of town. The deed was registered with a Philadelphia lawyer, and the transaction was conducted entirely through correspondence, suggesting Thomas never appeared in person to finalize the sale. Meadowbrook, Rebecca learned, had been a Quaker settlement. The Religious Society of Friends had a long history of opposing slavery and supporting racial equality. It would have been one of the few communities where a family like the Hendersons might find acceptance, or at least tolerance. She found a reference to the Henderson children attending a one-room schoolhouse that accepted students regardless of race, highly unusual for the time. There was a mention of Elizabeth Henderson in the records of the local Friends Meeting House, where she apparently taught Sunday school. But there was something else, something that made Rebecca's investigation suddenly urgent. In a local newspaper archive from 1903, she found a brief article about a fire on the Henderson farm. The report was matter-of-fact. A barn had burned down in the middle of the night, and while the family escaped unharmed, they had lost most of their livestock and winter provisions. The fire was ruled accidental, but a letter to the editor, published 2 days later, told a different story. A resident wrote cryptically about outside agitators and trouble following those who defy the natural order, suggesting that not everyone in Meadowbrook had welcomed the Henderson family. Rebecca sat back, her mind racing. The Hendricks family had fled Virginia only to find that hatred could follow them even to a progressive Quaker community. They had changed their name, started over, built a new life, and still faced threats. She needed to know what happened next. Did they stay in Meadowbrook? Did Samuel grow up there? Did he survive to adulthood? Or had the violence of that era eventually claimed him? The next morning, Rebecca booked a train to Pennsylvania. The town of Meadowbrook looked much as it must have in 1900, a cluster of stone buildings surrounded by rolling farmland, with a main street barely 2 blocks long. February frost clung to the bare trees, and smoke rose from chimneys into the gray sky. Rebecca had rented a car at the Philadelphia airport and driven the winding roads to this place where the Hendricks family had sought refuge over a century ago. Her first stop was the Meadowbrook Historical Society, housed in a converted Quaker meeting house. A woman in her 70s, introducing herself as Dorothy Chen, greeted Rebecca at the door. "You must be Dr. Torres," Dorothy said warmly, extending her hand. "I got your email about the Henderson family. I've been doing some digging myself since you wrote. Come in, it's freezing out there." The interior was cozy, heated by a wood stove in the corner. Shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes, photograph albums, and archival boxes. Dorothy led Rebecca to a wooden table where she had already laid out several documents. "The Henderson family is well remembered here," Dorothy began, settling into a chair. "Though not under that name for very long. When I saw your inquiry, I realized you were talking about the family we know as the Carters." Rebecca's eyes widened. "They changed their name again?" Dorothy nodded. "Around 1904, according to our records. After the barn fire, things got complicated. There was a faction in town, newcomers mostly, not original Quaker families, who didn't approve of how the Hendersons were raising Samuel. They made life difficult. Petitions to the school board, complaints to the constable, that sort of thing." She pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping. Then something remarkable happened. The original Quaker families, the ones whose ancestors founded this town, they rallied around the Hendersons, publicly defended them at town meetings. One family, the Whitcombs, even offered to legally adopt Samuel to protect him from any custody challenges, though the Hendersons refused to give him up. Dorothy's finger traced a line in an old ledger. But Thomas and Elizabeth knew the attention was dangerous, so they moved to a different property about 5 miles out of town, changed their name to Carter, and the Quaker community essentially closed ranks around them. If you asked anyone in town about the Hendersons, they'd tell you the family moved to Ohio after the fire. But the Carters? They'd been here all along. Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "And Samuel? What happened to him?" Dorothy smiled, a mysterious expression crossing her face. "That's where it gets interesting. Let me show you something." She walked to a cabinet and retrieved a photograph album, handling it with care. Opening it to a marked page, she turned it toward Rebecca. The photograph showed a young man, perhaps 20 years old, standing in front of a modest wooden building. He was black, dressed in a suit, holding a book. The sign on the building behind him read, "Meadowbrook Community School." "Samuel Carter," Dorothy said quietly, "taken around 1916. He became a teacher, Dr. Torres, right here in Meadowbrook. He taught reading and arithmetic to children of all backgrounds for nearly 40 years. Rebecca's throat tightened. She reached out to touch the photograph, then stopped herself. "He stayed. After everything his family went through, he stayed in this town?" "He did more than stay. He became one of its most beloved citizens. When Thomas died in 1912, Samuel took over the family farm. When Elizabeth passed in 1923, he cared for his sisters until they married. He never left Meadowbrook, and this community never let him down again, not after those early years. The town learned from its mistakes. Dorothy turned another page, revealing a group photograph